Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Truck drivers, what's a creepy story you've got? From the middle of nowhere? Episode 6. My dad knows a lot of truck drivers that would do the routes in Mexico. Dangerous and such cause of theft in certain areas. His friend talked about him driving from Sonora to, if I remember correctly, to Colima. There are some dangerous roads on those mountain passes, but as soon as you clear it, it's smooth sailing. He said before he got to the pass he stopped to get snacks and a few drinks. He said he was maybe 10 hours or so done so he could take his vacation. As he was hopping into the truck, a young lady asked if he could take her just up the road to her home where her family was waiting for her. He says yes, and he drives about an hour and drops her off at this large hacienda. She thanks him, kisses him, and tells him, "I will be here waiting for you when you come back, and to be careful on the mountain trails as they are very dangerous." He hugs her and says he will return for a beauty like her and kisses her back. After a slow and steady pace, he clears the mountains, delivers, and starts the trip back to Baja. He stops at that hacienda in the middle of the day and asks about the girl. The old gentleman says, "What does she looks like?" The man gets a sad expression on his face and says, "That was my daughter, she died on those mountain passes when her bus went over the side." Needless to say, it scared the hell out of him because he said that it was a kiss. I used to plow the Lowe's parking lot in Windham, Maine. Lots of late nights just driving back and forth in cat loader pushing snow. One night I noticed a man standing in the middle of the parking lot. By this point the parking lot lights had turned off and it was snowing pretty hard. I made my next pass closer, to see what he was doing. As I approached, I could see he was wearing a safety yellow jacket, blue jeans, and was smoking a cigarette. When I passed, he just slowly turned and stared at me. I waved, but he didn't wave back. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the orange glow of a burning cigarette. I got to the other end of the parking lot, and as I came back around, he was gone. I didn't think too much about it. Sometimes maintenance worked there overnight. But he would have had to almost run to get out of there so quickly. Several hours passed and enough snow had accumulated to go back and clear out the loading dock again. While clearing it out, I noticed the man was standing in the road behind the building, underneath the floodlight, smoking another cigarette. This time I was a little more concerned, because there weren't any cars there that I could find. So, I kept my eye on him in my mirrors, but the moment I went around the corner and came back, he was gone. This time I decided to investigate. By this point, the snow had slowed and didn't hinder your vision. I got out of the loader and walked to where he had been standing. There appeared to be a half pack of cigarette butts on the ground in one spot on top of the snow. There were footprints in the snow where it looked like someone had stood for an hour or more, without moving. I couldn't find any tracks leading to them, just tracks leaving. I followed them and they led to a small snowbank and then into the woods. I never saw this guy again. I never found any cars around the building and no signs that any of the doors to the building had been opened either. I was shaking that night. I used to plow the Lowe's parking lot in Windham, Maine. Lots of late nights just driving back and forth in cat loader pushing snow. One night I noticed a man standing in the middle of the parking lot. By this point the parking lot lights had turned off and it was snowing pretty hard. I made my next pass closer, to see what he was doing. As I approached, I could see he was wearing a safety yellow jacket, blue jeans, and was smoking a cigarette. When I passed, he just slowly turned and stared at me. I waved, but he didn't wave back. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the orange glow of a burning cigarette. I got to the other end of the parking lot, and as I came back around, he was gone. I didn't think too much about it. Sometimes maintenance worked there overnight. But he would have had to almost run to get out of there so quickly. Several hours passed and enough snow had accumulated to go back and clear out the loading dock again. While clearing it out, I noticed the man was standing in the road behind the building, underneath the floodlight, smoking another cigarette. This time I was a little more concerned, because there weren't any cars there that I could find. So, I kept my eye on him in my mirrors, but the moment I went around the corner and came back, he was gone. This time I decided to investigate. By this point, the snow had slowed and didn't hinder your vision. I got out of the loader and walked to where he had been standing. There appeared to be a half-pack of cigarette butts on the ground in one spot on top of the snow. There were footprints in the snow where it looked like someone had stood for an hour or more, without moving. I couldn't find any tracks leading to them, just tracks leaving. I followed them and they led to a small snowbank and then into the woods. I never saw this guy again. I never found any cars around the building and no signs that any of the doors to the building had been opened either. I was shaking that night. So, I have two stories. The first took place in 2012 when I was in the Army stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas. My ex-wife and I were driving from Kansas to back home, just north of STL, on leave, and we had a late start. Well, we were on I-70 between Casey and Columbia, Missouri, so this is middle of nowhere, pitch black dark at 2 a.m. The road was empty, no towns or exits around for a fairly good distance, and all of a sudden this man in a white shirt runs out of the woods and kneels on the white line as if he were praying. I swerved as close to the median as I could. I don't know if he was trying to kill himself or what, but it was certainly an eerie situation. My second story took place summer of 2015. I was on I-10 between Fort Stockton, Texas and Junction, Texas heading east, and I was running hotshot at the time. I had stopped on the shoulder to check my trailer plug connection because I was having connectivity problems with it. All of a sudden this black Pontiac Grand Prix stops about 1/8 mile or so ahead of me, and this woman gets out screaming for help and started to run towards me, but the man who was driving grabbed her, hit her, and threw her in the backseat, so I grabbed my winch bar and ran towards their car as fast as I could. Unfortunately he got back in and booked it. I ran back to my truck and rode through those gears as fast as I could and tried to chase them while calling 911. Unfortunately he was able to lose me. I don't know what ended up happening. It bothers me to this day. I hope they located them, and she was okay. Not knowing haunts me. Not a truck story, but I was completely freaked out at the time. For many years after a day of snowboarding to save accommodation costs, I would drive to the middle of nowhere away from anyone and sleep in the back of my 4WD. One night I was unusually tired after a huge day and a large meal to aid recovery, anticipating a call of nature parked within a short walk to a public toilet, so I settle in, fall asleep quickly, but kept getting woken up by the strangest noises, scraping sounds with the occasional thud and soft animal-like noises I just could not identify that seemed to be coming from all around the vehicle. After about the sixth time I was woken up, 1 a.m., and racking my brain what it could logically be, I came up with the theory that a kangaroo must have got trapped in the toilet cubicle and scratching the shit out of it desperate to get out, which left me with a dilemma. If I left it there my disturbance would continue and I was in no condition to drive to another spot, especially in the dark and freshly fallen snow, plus I would have the distressed animal on my conscience. On the other hand, kangaroos can harm you if they are upset and decide you are to blame in any way, particularly if it is a joey that is stuck and the upset mother is on the outside of the cubicle. Then if the mob is still with it, the males are huge and can also tear you a new one. Laying there, absolutely black night, not even a light in the toilet because it is a national park, I decided to free whatever was trapped in the stall. I loaded up with layers of coats, 3 pairs of pants, head torch so I had my hands free, and grabbed my GoPro stick, the only weapon-like object I had, just in case I was attacked. I have everything ready and get out of the driver's side door and stride towards the toilet. Everything around me moves. What I thought were trees initially. By the light of the interior light activated by me exiting the 4WD was a large mob of kangaroos, caught completely off guard, my mind primed with the possible danger kangaroos pose. I fumbled to turn on the head torch and wildly swinging the GoPro stick, swearing off my mind, overwhelmed by the sound of equally panicked animals all around me. I get the head torch going and see the mob disappear into the bush. Seeing the danger gone, I go check the cubicle, nothing. I go back to bed angry at kangaroos for messing with my sleep and scaring me. Daylight, I wake up and use the toilet. Walking back to the 4WD, I see what had happened. The whole white 4WD that had a healthy coat of 800 km road grime had almost been completely licked clean by the kangaroos. They must have been after the salt used on the mountain roads to de-ice. Not a truck story, but middle of nowhere. Brief me and my family on the Taconic on a late night drive. For those that don't know the Taconic, it's a fairly hilly and forested road. More often than not the median has trees. We come to a straight part and suddenly a landscaping truck pulls out into the road from the shoulder with no lights on. We swerve, almost lose control, and come to a stop. We all went out to offer assistance, only there wasn't any truck on the road at all. It was a fairly bright full moonlit night, so our darkness acclimated eyes could see fairly well. There just wasn't anything there, not even a sound. We were all kind of freaked out. I had a delivery at a John Deere place in TN and I saw on Google Maps there was a big dirt lot I could park and wait for my delivery time in the morning. Nothing really around it. There were a few empty old semi-trailers there. It was like 3 a.m. I was woken up to like metal noises, so I got up and looked out and there was like a few homeless people coming out the back of the trailer. I immediately left. Really not that creepy, I guess I just ran up on some homeless camp, but scared me. I was driving down I-80 headed east in Iowa. It was a section where there was a small grass median with a cable barrier and 3 lanes of travel on each side. I was coming up in an area where there was a car parked on the westbound side shoulder. It appears to be empty, so I paid no mind. We see lots of abandoned cars. Just driving and scanning the road as normal, I see the driver of the abandoned car on the other side of the rail looking to cross. I was in the middle of nowhere, so I knew something was up. He waited till I got closer and sprinted trying to get in front of my truck to end himself. Luckily, I was aware enough to avoid him. When I was over the road, I was always around the Mississippi, Louisiana and Alabama arc because that's where the company's headquarters was. So, I was on I-59 in Mississippi heading towards New Orleans. It was like 1:30 in the morning, and I needed to stop soon because I was running out of hours. I found a little spot in a rest area that had no bathrooms or anything, just parking spots for trucks. As I'm finishing my logbook, a car pulls up to the stop. We make eye contact and I keep doing my thing. The guy stays in his car for about 5 minutes and just leaves. I finished what I'm doing, I do my cab security routine, I always been sort of a scared type, climb in the bunk, and start surfing the web as per usual. Less than 30 minutes passed, and I hear a car park in the area. I took a peek out of the blinds and it's the same car and guy. I start to feel weird. The car leaves and I said okay, not important, but I'm a little spooked so I stay on my phone. Maybe 15 minutes passed again, and I heard another car. I looked out, same car and guy, and at this point I said I was leaving this place. I don't know what happened and I don't regret moving from there, but it was really bizarre to see someone up and leave a rest area, drive to God knows where, come back on the other side of the highway and stopped in the same place you just stopped minutes ago multiple times and not even get out of your vehicle. Not me, but I'm a teacher and many years ago we had Miccosukee Native American students that would come to our school, and I learned a lot about their culture. They lived out on Tamiami Trail between Miami and Naples in the Everglades, which is a pretty desolate 2-lane through the swamp prairie. Well, foolish me, one day we had a no-name tropical storm on Halloween. Schools were closed, but we got about 5 inches of rain that day. Pitch black outside. So, I thought, let's tell ghost stories. So, the kids are telling me mildly creepy stories about chairs that moved by themselves and footsteps they have heard, etc. Well, the Miccosukee girl speaks up. Apparently, they have a cultural belief that they can see the dead. Spirits are part of their everyday existence. They believe, for example, if you get up from a chair, immediately a ghost replaces you in the seat. And some can see the dead. So, she starts talking about seeing ghosts in the Everglades and the story of her uncle who was driving down Tamiami Trail in the middle of the night and sees a grinning guy standing on the side of the road. He knows what's up with him in 1 second, so he refuses to make eye contact and passes him. Sure, a minute later there he is on the side of road again, smiling and waving. No, this uncle says and motors by. Then he feels the man sitting in the passenger seat next to him. He just grips the wheel and stares straight ahead, and soon enough the presence vanishes. Now I know this sounds like Ghost Story 101, but to hear it in that dark rainy Halloween scared me. Then she continued. She lived close to where the ValueJet flight crashed in the Everglades. And she described seeing the dead walking out of the swamps on certain nights near her house. She said this all in fact in a way I totally believed her. She had a younger sister who didn't speak much. They were in 8th and 7th grade, and I took them on a class trip to NYC in 2005. We went to Ground Zero Memorial and the younger sister refused to get off the bus, just shaking her head staring into the distance. I asked her sister what's up, since I already had a clue, and she said there are dead people all around us, even in the aisle of the bus. This younger girl was terrified. So, I left them on the bus with the bus driver while we walked around. They have a cultural belief that they cannot enter any cemetery because of the spirits of the dead, and Ground Zero was a huge cemetery. I'll never forget those moments. Hope this isn't too out of the context of the questions being asked. From my dad's best friend, not a truck driver but still messed up, in the 70s he would go to the sand dunes, buggy racing, in Yuma all the time but usually on the weekends. Well, he happened to have a day off during the week and went there. When he got there he saw a line of gas tankers leaving, which was surprising because there were no gas stations at the exit. Also, not an area set up for large trucks. So, they get to the access road they normally use about a mile from the freeway, and there is another fuel tanker but with its hoses out, and it was dumping fuel into the sand. Once the driver saw them he quickly wrapped things up. One of the guys with them had a camera and decided to take pictures. Well, a while later an off-road vehicle showed up with 3 big guys in it and the cam and took his camera and basically told them to get lost. Not wanting to get in a fight they left. A couple of days later they went back out there with shovels and dug in their area and found fuel in the sand. There was enough that they could light the sand on fire. They reported it to the local sheriff, but as far as he knew nothing came of it. They suspected it had something to do with the gas shortage, but that didn't make a lot of sense. I'm a truck driver, but this story isn't from my truck. Was driving back from a night out with work. This was around 11 p.m. and about 5 miles from where we all lived. There was 3 people in my car including myself. We came up to a roundabout where you can only go straight on or right. We were going straight on, but if you were to go right, there is a mile or so long road with a 2-mile long industrial estate halfway down it. No houses, train stations or anything, nothing really around unless you took a good hour-long walk. Anyway, as we were crossing this roundabout we all looked to the right. There was just a man stood in the middle of one of the lanes staring at the roundabout just as the light faded from the streetlights, maybe about 3/400 m down this road. He had no dog, no car parked at the side of the road, he wasn't moving, just staring towards the roundabout with a very blank impression. Might not be the creepiest, but I'm glad we didn't have to go right. Was driving a delivery truck headed back through a deserted part of the town that was abandoned due to crime and vandalism. One of the roads a bunch of people drove up in dirt bikes. A car stopped in front of us. They tried to steal something. Told us to get out. They told us to get out. The other driver jumped out with a lead pipe and a gun. They gave us a tough time. He fired a warning shot on the ground and gave me the pipe. One of the guys on the dirt bike said it's the wrong guy. He said, "Sorry, I thought you were someone else." It was a few more years before I went back through those roads never again after sunset. I was at the time on a poorly planned and badly timed ornithological expedition in northeastern Kazakhstan, near Lake Sison. Early winter, temperatures going to -40, winds, all while the world falls apart around in the early 1990s. We traveled in a Soviet military-issue light off-roader and a light military truck with a summer camper on it, in which we slept in the wilderness. One night we crossed a mountain pass and drove into a valley during a snow blaze. Decided to stop and camp near a road. We had an external gasoline air heater running, but the truck driver slept in his cabin. He had a hammock. The truck had a 60-liter hot water pot for such occasions and wrapped a sheet of tarp around a cabin for extra insulation. That was our usual arrangement for many nights already. Inside the camper, we had 3 people, a 200-liter barrel of gasoline and a large can of propane. So, yes. In the middle of the night, I woke up to screams and realized that the truck was on fire. I cut the fire extinguisher bizarrely and jumped outside in my underwear. The tarp caught fire, obviously from the heater, but the driver already had it pulled down into the snow and was jumping on it. The wind was howling angrily and drawing away whatever heat was in my body. I threw down the extinguisher and ran back into the camper lest I froze. The next morning the snow blaze was out, and I walked outside to realize that we camped in the middle of an ancient burial site, small mounds of stones atop the graves, some of them dug out long ago, probably by treasure hunters. Of course, could just be a coincidence. I've had an experience. It causes me stress to this day. 2001, my best friend and I joined the Marines after high school in '98. I was in a motorcycle accident, and I was released from my contract. After healing from my motorcycle accident, my friend was on leave, home from 29 Palms in Southern California. He would tell me about Tijuana. We opted to go there together on his next leave. That's the background. After we spend a few days in Mexico, I drop my friend off at 29 Palms and drive home to Colorado Springs. So, I'm not a long-haul trucker, but this was an experience I had while on this road trip all the same. After driving all day, it's getting dark and I'm tired. I spent too much money while in Mexico, so rather than staying at a motel I decide to find a well-lit parking lot to pull off into and get some sleep. I see the gift shop for the Grand Canyon advertised on many roadside billboards. That's it. I'll take a nap there. It's now just past midnight and I am dead tired. I finally reached the gift shop and saw an empty car park, but it's well lit and it'll do. I pull in right under a parking lot light pole. I fell asleep leaning against my pillow on the driver door of my Chevy S10. I woke up and I saw a guy wearing a scream mask and work coveralls at the front of my truck. This guy is slowly tilting his head left and right, just looking at me through the front window. I sit up and go to start my truck. I see another guy, also wearing a scream mask, outside the driver's side door window. He is crouched on the other side of my door, also tilting his head left and right, just watching me. While I am typing this out, my heart is racing. This was intense. I start my truck and back out of the parking spot. As I am backing out, I see a yellow Ryder truck parked a few spaces down. I can see into the interior/cargo area of the Ryder truck. I see people sitting along the walls of the Ryder truck, just staring across at each other. Blank stares. They don't even acknowledge me backing out. I fall out of there as fast as I can, and I don't rest until I drive home. I have no idea what the two guys with masks are doing. I have no idea what the people in the Ryder truck were doing. To this day I feel tense every time I think about it. Weird things do happen, and this experience really opened my eyes to the fact that people are never really safe, and we exist one step away from who knows what. I was driving home from work. I live in a rural part of North Louisiana, so a lot of the roads, especially at night, are virtually abandoned. I was driving by Douglas Cemetery, a small, maybe 2-acre cemetery between where I work and where I live. Before I could see the cemetery, I noticed it got cold. Like really cold. Way too cold for LA in the middle of the summer, and I knew it was the outside air because my Jeep was window and doorless. As I approached the graveyard, I slowed and saw a man standing at the gate. The man was tall, white-bearded, with a long gray coat and black boots. He was standing, motionless and expressionless, holding what I could clearly tell was a lantern. When I looked at him, he looked not like he was staring at me, but through me. It was freezing at this point, and the moment I looked into his face, a deep chill made its way down my spine. My instincts took over and I gunned it out of there. Never bothered to look back. Still drive by that cemetery every day. Not at all what OP asked for, but it seems to fit with some of the other stories on here. One Sunday morning in the early 2000s in Las Vegas. Friends and I were hungover and heading from a hotel on the Strip to one well off it, so we were actually on a freeway. My friend was driving with 4 of us as passengers, me in the back. The driver points out this car ahead and a lane over that seems to be going just a bit slower than traffic and not really staying in their lane. We all figure it's a drunk or tired driver, since that seemed likely for the time and place. As we approach, we see no one inside. It's a bit lost to the haze of memory, but I believe there was some debate as to whether anyone could see the seatbelt stretched, which would have suggested the driver was buckled in. But if they were in there, they were leaned all the way over because no one saw a trace of a body inside. Just as we passed the phantom driver, there was a curve. We saw, and heard, the side of the car smash into the guardrails, bounce off, smash again, and repeat a few more times as we went on our merry way. I believe we could see it eventually stop on the side of the road before it passed out of view, still with not a soul visible inside. To this day, I don't know if it was a driver having a medical emergency that we just couldn't see, b, a car being towed that was poorly secured and just rolled off the back of a trailer, continuing straight on its path of destruction, or c, a child on a joyride, just working the pedals without seeing where they were going. Also, I was not a trucker but drove cross-country for work. I had a small truck with a shell topper I slept in at night and a small pop-up trailer hitched on the back. I parked at an old rest stop in Wyoming for the night. Woke up in the middle of the night to a car doing circles around me. He honked and did another lap, then parked right next to me. I'm in the back of my truck with blinds along the windows of the topper so I know no one can see into the back. A guy starts to get out of the car. Immediately I started yelling, "Get the feck back." He stops in shock, and a few seconds later starts explaining he was going to ask for a cigarette. I'm well aware it was impossible to see into the back of my truck with the blinds down, so now he was lying. I kept yelling to get back. He eventually got back into his car and drove off. He must have been looking to break into my truck or try to steal my trailer off the back. Would have been terrifying to wake up to someone lifting up my topper while sleeping, less the way it happens still scared the hell out of me. My neighbor, who was originally from Hong Kong, used to drive taxis back in the early 80s to late 90s. He told me in the late 80s there was a serial killer who was a taxi driver, and he was killing women and dumping their bodies all over HK. You can Google this. He remembered one night dropping off a customer, and on his way home he passed by a taxi pulled off to the side of a hillside on a route and where not too much traffic would come and go. He told me he thought about pulling over and checking if the fellow taxi driver was okay. HK taxis all have the same red markings. But he was tired and figured if the taxi needed help he would have asked on the radio, so he thought nothing of it and kept driving home. A few weeks later they caught the guy, and it was the same taxi. He recognized the plates and numbers that he saw pulling over the side of the road. He said he felt a chill down his neck when he saw the news. Not a truck driver, but my dad is. He once told us one time he was driving through a very rural area somewhere in the UK. Can't remember where. Trees on one side of the road, and farmland on the other side. Hess got a bit lost trying to find his offload point, so he pulled over to get the map out and have a look at it and phoned the place he was trying to find. So, he pulls over, turns the engine off and trawls through his maps trying to find where he is. When he saw flashing lights coming from the trees next to him, he carried on looking at the map when a large white van pulled into the forest and turned their lights off very quickly. 3 police cars came speeding by in the same direction and went past where the van was hiding and off into the distance. The van was lit on fire and the lights in the trees he saw turned out to be people with flashlights, carrying large, long-looking things and throwing them onto and into the burning van. Dad presumed that it was either a mass of drugs being burned or bodies. So, he just left as fast as he was able to and didn't stop till he found a garage to pull into some 10 miles away. By the time he got there he was half an hour past his driving time and had to phone the place he couldn't find and say he was lost. They sent someone out to find him and he followed them about a mile down the road to their place. He never found out what was going on with the van in the woods. And I don't think he ever wants to find out. My dad told me 1 year ago. It was about a well-known driver from his job at that time. He drove basically anything with wheels, but most of the time trucks and lorries. This time was a minivan. He was on his way back to the job office after delivering some papers to another town, and between towns there was a 40-minute drive in the middle of an enough to not say abandoned road with barely light poles on the sides, but usually transited. 30 minutes into the drive he said that he suddenly couldn't turn his head to his right, passenger seat, but from the corner of his eye he could see someone sitting there. It was a small person. What made it creepier was that such a person started insulting him kind of loudly. It lasted about 10 minutes till he was close to the toll entrance of the town and that small person disappeared. He said it was some kind of leprechaun. The local community believed in them, so that was his explanation. Not a truck driver, but something creepy happened when I moved from PA to North Carolina back in 2001. I'd been driving all day, and kind of meandering my way south, because why not? Hit the mountains along US 68 headed west. I was moving to Murphy, and was debating pulling over and sleeping around the town of Cashiers. Had I had GPS back in those days, I would have, because the next 30 or so miles are nothing but switchbacks and weird turns. I was dozy, driving solo, and it was around midnight. That's when I realized I had somebody sitting next to me in the passenger seat, who I had a conversation with. I don't remember it, for the full 30 miles or so of LOL roadway. Finally, I spotted a convenience store, went in, had coffee, and walked back out realizing what had just happened. I either had something supernatural happen, or I basically sleep drove horribly twisty mountain 2-lane highway for an hour. To this day, I haven't decided which is worse as far as the creep factor goes. Many years ago, when I was young and in university, I pulled over and picked up a hitchhiker in the middle of the day heading north from Louisiana to Illinois. I think I was on the northern edge of LA at 55, perhaps southern Mississippi. Anyway, the guy is bald, tall, well-built, and very well prepared. He has a backpack with lots of meticulously organized tools around the outside. Meticulously put together, this guy. He gets in, sets his backpack in the back, holds out his hand across the center console of my beat-up Toyota Tercel, into which he barely fits, and says, "Name's Sam." I say, "I'm Einhard. Now, I'll give you a ride, but you have to promise not to rob or murder me," in the joking tones of someone whose mother always told him not to pick up hitchhikers, but who knows that he knows better than she did. He looks taken aback, but not offended, and then smiles, and in his slightly Texan accent, says nobody else who has picked me up has ever had the foresight to make me promise not to hurt them. Maybe it'll catch on. He laughs. I laugh, but I don't know why. I took him to the northern edge of Mississippi, and he tells me he needs to go west, and I'm still going north, so I let him out at a rest stop. Nothing else, but that initial conversation sticks out in my memory, but it was decades ago. I still remember his face, and his backpack, and his response. It's unsettling to think about now, but somehow it seemed perfectly normal then. Years ago, was driving west, in Wisconsin. Super early in the AM and I was exhausted. When I got near the 1994 split, I hallucinated a person, Sam Kinison-shaped, standing on the edge of the median, facing me and pointing at the ramp I needed to take off to the right. It scared me, woke me, and I took the correct ramp. If not, I would have hit a bridge abutment a couple 100 feet ahead of me when I fell fully asleep. The adrenaline kept me shaking for a while, and then I pulled over to sleep. That was the last time I ever drove that tired. Even now, if I'm tired, I don't care where I park, I get off the road even if it's just for a power nap. I remember that night like it was yesterday. People, if you're too tired to drive, don't. Around 15 years ago, I drove box trucks doing some delivery from Cedar Rapids, Iowa up to Waterloo, Iowa. I was pulling off the interstate onto the highway that goes into the city, and there was a guy standing on the side of the road where you come off and start to merge. Man had a huge eating grin and was just pointing his hand like a fake gun, pretending to shoot each driver as they came by. It was such a brief encounter, but it totally sketched me out. Not a trucker, but one summer we went camping with my dad, his wife, and my sister. I was 15 around that time. After about 2 or 3 days of camping one night, my dad decided to take us all into town for dinner. The main town was about 20 minutes away and my dad decided to take a back route that was supposed to be quicker. So, my dad was driving, it was nighttime, and it was a small one-lane road with absolutely no lighting, so everything was pitch black, no other cars around on the road, so we could only see what the truck's headlights were shining right in front of us. I swear if what happened next hadn't been seen by all 4 of us in the truck, I would think I hallucinated it or something. So about 5 minutes away from the campground, keep in mind this was a split second, but out of nowhere we saw what looked like an older lady, long gray hair, in the middle of the road, running towards the truck, frantically, and screaming. In a split second my dad swerved into the other lane and missed hitting her, and we kept on driving just because we were all scared. We called the police and reported it. When we headed back to the campground we drove by slowly and saw no sign of the lady or anything else. Sleeping was almost impossible in a tent that night, and the next day we packed our gear and went back home. My favorite story is when this guy drives through the town of Needles, along Highway 5 a little outside of Los Angeles. Apparently there was a lot of satanic ritual stuff going on in the area. This story is told from a Redditor's perspective. He says he was a former Marine and was driving through the town, aware of the cult stuff. This was in the middle of nowhere. Anyways, he's driving along the highway and stops at a car parked in the middle of the road, with clothes scattered about, and people lying face down in the road. The guy says his senses said something was off, so he loaded his pistol, gassed his car, and sped past the accident. After he got about 100 yards up he stopped the car. The couple in the road got up and looked at the car, but then all of a sudden about 20 people rose up from the bushes on the sides of the road. I have a pretty scary story I vaguely remember from when I was 14 or so. This isn't from me directly but from my uncle. He used to drive an old storage/delivery truck that was rusting in places and practically falling apart. He had to make this long truck haul from Springfield, Illinois to Orlando, Florida, about a 2 to 4 day drive. He has to drive through a lot of the countryside, especially in the dark. When he made it to Georgia, it was terribly dark out with just one narrow road in what looked like to him endless plains, no trees or creeks or ponds etc. Just some grass and a little one-way road that the truck could barely fit on. It was clearly some kind of farming ground because you would occasionally see some farmland or growing crops nearby. Well, it was getting to the point where he could start to see some land formations like mountains and trees and such. This one tree on top a hill stuck out for some reason. It was pretty unique. Then, he said he kept passing that same tree without turning around or stopping. Over, and over and over. He'd go to say at least 6 times he passed that same land fixture and unique tree. He was getting low on some gas, so he pulled over and filled his tank up with some gas container reserves he had in the back of his truck. Once he got out he felt a chilling sense of dread and as if something were about to collapse on top of him and tear him apart. Scared, he quickly got back in his truck and drove the rest of the way to Orlando. He also mentioned it seemed as if the darkness outside wouldn't change and the clock was oddly slower than usual. 2 years later and he still tells me this story and I always say something like must have been the darkness or you are driving for too long. But he swears he glitched out the universe or something lol. I live in England, my dad lives out in the sticks near Gainsborough, Lincolnshire. One day we were driving to his house and a large black Jaguar just kind of melted out of the hedgerow and crossed the road in front of us. This was broad daylight, and it took its time, so we got a good look at it. This was not a case of mistaken identity, it wasn't a large black dog or a fox or anything. It was unmistakably a black Jaguar. We were pretty new to the area and since found out that this was something of a local legend and seen by quite a lot of people but never officially acknowledged or anything. Apparently, some time back a law was passed prohibiting and heavily controlling the ownership of exotic pets. For good reason too. Those things are killers. Most likely explanation is that some time back someone released it rather than turning it in to be destroyed and since then it's been living in the pine plantations around my dad's house living off the pretty abundant population of roe deer and rabbits. Needless to say, we were confused by this encounter and actually didn't mention it to anyone for some time for fear of being ridiculed. After that I saw it on a couple more occasions, but this was nearly 15 years back and haven't heard anything of it since so I presume it just died of old age. I was in the late 60s and my family was going north to Round Lake, Saskatchewan in June. We had a converted school bus camper, so it was a big vehicle. The night was dark, then a full moon rose. We were on a 2-lane with no shoulder, wetlands on both sides. Frogs began to jump onto the road. Not just a few thousand. So many that the road appeared to be a living thing. Dad slowed off the bus, then tried to stop. We did a skid into the other lane. Slowed again but kept going, sliding on frog flesh. This continued for several miles. I was about 12 and terrified. It was a real, live sci-fi horror show. Later I learned that the first full moon in June is Get Back to the Water Day, after a long winter in hibernation. Not a truck driver but me and my girl were driving cross-country. Somewhere in Pig, Texas we are causally driving not speeding and this lady pulls up in the other lane and is freaking out on us. I could see how enraged she was and got worried. Told my GF obviously not to stop. She stayed with us for 20 minutes freaking out on us till we hit the next town. The only thing I could think was that we were punk/bikers? My girl has bright dyed hair and we both are covered in tattoos. Maybe that made her angry? Not a truck driver but I hitched a ride with a friend who hauls perishable goods to a distant town nightly. 4 a.m. homecoming. The cargo was delivered, and he is returning home. I hitched a ride at the intersection and 40 minutes in, we felt the truck was shaky. He suspects a flat front tire. We parked on the side of the road. I got up to vape. The expressway is surrounded by woods. All of a sudden I heard some rustling on the trees on my right. I then hear branches breaking continuously. This went on for 2 to 4 minutes I think and then it stopped. Moments later, another trucker stopped and offered to help. We departed at 5:26 a.m. I don't know what that in the woods is. Maybe a bear or Bigfoot? I'll never know. I worked in a gold mine just outside of Fairbanks, Alaska. Our crew had about 8 to 10 people on it, spread out over the entire mill, which was a compound of 6 to 7 huge buildings in an area of about 3/4 square mile. It wasn't uncommon for you to not see another person for almost your entire shift, and we used radios to communicate. Most of us had the corded mic from our radio and clipped it right to our shirt beneath our ear, since we had to wear earplugs at all times, and needed to be able to hear as best as we could. This made the radio traffic loud enough to hear in the super loud areas of the mill. One night it was raining fairly good. I was walking outside down this road that had a 4-story structure on my right, and 6 to 7-story tall, huge tanks on my left. It was lit by the yellow industrial lights, so at night, the shadows always played tricks on your eyes, especially if you were tired. We would see shadow people all the time, you just became used to it. As I was walking, my radio started crackling. A really odd drawn-out gasp where someone struggling to take a deep breath came over the radio, and all of a sudden the power went out. Right as the power went out, a voice came over the radio that sounded almost like an old lady's whisper mixed with Gollum from LOTR. She said, "They can't see us if we're not in the light." I froze where I was, and after about 10 seconds I got on the radio and asked which one of my guys said that. Nobody knew what I was talking about. Then all of a sudden, a loud laugh came over the radio, and the power came back on. That night was terrifying. I was a grocery delivery driver for about a year a couple of years back. Van, not truck, but I'm going to jump in anyway. There was one delivery I made that freaked me out. It was in the middle of the countryside in England, right at the end of an exceptionally long, dirty lane. There were a few houses on the lane, but they were very spread apart. The company I delivered for was quite high-end, so delivering to isolated places was pretty common. It was late on an autumn evening, so it was pitching black outside. I reached the house at the end, and there were a bunch of people outside in the driveway. A couple of kids and 3 or 4 adults. I'm not sure what they were doing, but as I arrived they all went into the house. It wasn't a huge delivery, enough that I could carry all of the bags in one go, so I picked them all up and walked up the gravel driveway and knocked on the front door. A man opened the door pretty quickly and gave me a huge smile. Clearly forced, a massive, ear-to-ear grin. He beckoned for me to come inside, and turned and walked back into the house, still smiling. Immediately, that's a bit weird. Normally we just leave the bags on the inside of the front door. People only tend to ask us to take them all the way inside if they are elderly, whereas this guy was clearly in his 30s. But it's policy that if they ask us to bring them inside we do, so I followed him into the house. He led me to the kitchen. It was very dimly lit inside, only a few lamps on rather than any of the main lights. He approached his fridge/freezer and opened the freezer door, then turned to me. "The freezer is full." He spoke. 2 of the 6 bags I was carrying had frozen items in. "Okay," I replied slowly. "Do you have somewhere else these can go then?" He didn't reply. He just stood there, staring at me, this huge grin still on his face. It was at this point that I noticed how silent the house was. I'd seen at least 5 or 6 people, not including this guy, enter the house when I arrived, and it was dead silent inside. 5 seconds passed of him doing nothing but smiling and staring. My skin started crawling as I repeated the question. He didn't reply again, just continued staring. Like I said, I delivered to isolated places all the time and it had never bothered me, but I suddenly became very aware that I was standing in the kitchen of a totally stranger's house, in a building right in the middle of nowhere. I pushed down the urge to run as I decided that I'd had enough of this. I put the bags down on the floor, thanked him, and walked back to the door, walking quickly. He came with me to the door and stood in the doorway watching me as I walked down the driveway to the van, which grinned still on his face. I was incredibly thankful that I'd already turned the van around when I arrived, and I accelerated down the lane a lot faster than I probably should have. I could still see the guy standing in the doorway until I lost sight of the house in my mirror. Had plenty of nightmares of that man's grinning face since then. Definitely my creepiest experience. I am not a trucker, but a lot of these stories brought up a memory of mine from when I was a child that still terrifies me to think about. We are from Utah, and when I was 5 or 6 years old, we took a road trip in a rented camper. We got to California. There is this specific area around Nephi, Utah that had some kind of massacre in the mid-1900s. All I know is that some kind of mass murder occurred out there, and all of the bodies were buried in the desert area off of I-15. Needless to say, it is an eerie part of UT and that main highway travel. Anyway, we were on our way back. I was sitting in the front seat next to my mother. My dad was driving. We were coming through Nephi, Utah near the massacre area. All of a sudden, my dad starts to get a little panicked and tells my mom to lean over and look into his side view mirror. I did as well. What we saw was the back of the trailer door was flapping open and shut in the wrong direction. To give a visual, the back of the trailer was a single door that opened from the right side and the door hinges were on the left. The door was swinging back and forth off of the hinges. The completely most impossible way. Freaked out, my dad pulls the trailer over, thinking something was broken. We get out of the trailer off the side of 1-15. It's late evening, the sun is starting to go down, and no cars around. We go through the door and look at it. The hinges were latched and in perfect condition and the door was latched. We were completely baffled. We knew what we saw, and it made zero sense compared to what we were staring at now. No signs that it was even capable of doing that and no defects. We stood out there for about 15 minutes, rechecking everything. All of a sudden, this green, Oldsmobile car pulls up probably 100 yards behind us. We originally thought someone was stopping to see if we needed any help. These three, massive Polynesian guys get out of the car. They just stood there for a sec, staring at us. Then they walked to the back of their car, looking at their trunk as if something were wrong with their car as well. All I remember is that I had the most terrifying feeling in my body. I was scared. I looked at my parents to just see what they were going to do with the situation. I saw the same look on both of my parents' faces. Fear. Something did not feel right about this situation and my parents felt it too. My mom whispers for me to get back in the trailer. I ran in there so fast, she wasn't going to tell me twice. I was watching out the window as my dad was trying to hurriedly get everything secured back up. The three guys noticed my parents trying to get back to the trailer and all three stars, what I remember and thought of it as, marching quickly towards our trailer. My parents ran into the trailer, started it up, and my dad gunned it out of there before the guys could get the trailer. It was pretty creepy, and I always wondered what would have happened if we hadn't have gotten out of there. I have always thought something bad would happen. My granddad was a trucker in Mexico. This is a story I heard my mom tell. Supposedly he was just driving with the windows down when suddenly a lechuza, an owl, but usually witches disguised as them, landed on the mirror and stared at him and I think talked to him. I don't know what it said to him, but they say he came home in a rush and was very scared. Well, I live in Vietnam. I'm not a truck driver, however, my uncle is, and I had an extremely creepy, scary experience with him exactly 2 years ago. So, that night I went with my uncle on a trip to the city to ship some goods back to our hometown, in the countryside. We began to move a little bit late, around 11:30 p.m. since my uncle overslept after we had dinner. And we had to drive past some exceptionally large rice fields as we have a lot of these in the suburban of Vietnam. I had a nap after we drove about half the way to the city. When I woke up, it was already past 2 in the morning, and we were driving past these huge rice fields. In Vietnam, farmers usually sleep in tent houses built right in the middle of the fields in order to take care of them better. So, you usually see their silhouettes wander around at any time both day and night, a little bit scary if you are not used to it. However, that night, what I witnessed was completely different. Our truck moved quite slowly with the windows open to let the cool air inside. After I woke up, I took a glance at the fields and didn't see anything, which is unusual, but of course, there's nothing wrong with that. Then, I noticed there were some black figures on those fields ahead and I thought there they are, the hard-working farmers. But as our truck went past the figures I was shocked as what right next to us on the fields were not the kind of farmers as usual but two black figures hovering on the top of the rice fields. I mean, I couldn't see their legs and there was spaces below their knees which mean, they had no legs and they were headless. Those two headless figures without legs each held a lantern in their hand and hovered in circle on the rice fields. Speechless, I looked at my uncle and saw the same scary look in his eyes. We sped as fast as we could through the fields and didn't say a word until our arriving at the city. When we were back home in the afternoon, I told my mom what we saw, and she said those were the ghosts of farmers who died on those fields in the wartime. They still want to protect and take care of their rice fields even if they are dead. My friend is a truck driver, and a few months ago he parked his truck a block away from the place where he lives in Wisconsin. At around 2 a.m. he hears his alarm going off. He gets to his truck and sees a Nissan sedan smashed into his trailer. It was bad. The driver survived. The passenger was laying by the trailer with his head almost missing. The impact was so powerful that the guy's head had almost exploded. His brain was all over the truck, including the inside of the wheels. Police said the speed of that Nissan was over 100 miles per hour. After this incident, the dead guy's parents for days were coming to that place crying and asking my friend not to wash the remains of their son off the truck. The Nissan driver went to prison for 25 years. Not a truck driver, but my cousin worked at a gas station in Canada on a major highway and saw something crazy. She was robbed at gunpoint once, but her craziest story is the guy. The guy was a man that was wandering around the area of the station one day across the highway. She couldn't see him very well from the station, but she could see him laying down in the grassy ditch beside the highway. He kept getting up and walking around and then would lay down in the grass again. She watched him for a few hours before he crossed the highway and came to the store. When he entered the convenience store, my cousin was horrified. He was extremely dirty, mud and grass caked to his clothes and hands, he had no shoes on, and the worst part, he had cocoons in his hair. Like from caterpillars, full-on cocoons throughout his wild, matted hair. He was so odd, unkempt, and weird, she felt uncomfortable as soon as he walked in. He ended up being harmless, just incredibly strange. The strange part is the town that my cousin lives in has a population of about 50 people, everyone knew everyone, and the town's weirdos were all well known. This man was a stranger, someone who had obviously been living rough for years. Imagine being outside and homeless for so long you have cocoons in your hair? Yikes. I've only been driving trucks for 3 years, but I do have one that gives me goosebumps. I was heading out whoop at about 4 a.m., pitch black. I was driving down this road and hadn't seen traffic for about 2 hours. I seen these lights coming towards me, then as I got closer they just disappeared. This was a road with only 2 lanes, so it had to go past me, but nothing did. There were no beak lights or even any roads to turn onto, it just vanished. Now this isn't the creepy part. About 2 months later I went down the same road, but I had another driver with me. As we came to roughly the same part, he started telling me about this time he went down this road and seen this car come towards him and suddenly vanish. Gets creepier because he said that another driver he was with told him this story when they came up that road together. Some years back, it was around 5:30 a.m. still very dark out. I was on a 2-lane on the Arkansas-Missouri state line, was listening to a local radio station, and it gave me my exact location and said stop and find shelter. Now tornadoes had been spotted in the area and it's dark and you can't see them. It's kind of like somehow the disc jockey was watching me, but where the hell am I supposed to go? Rain started coming down very hard, so I took that as a good sign to back it down, clinch my butt checks, and ride the storm out. Or another time I was coming through Waco and I looked up at a walking path over the interstate and a feller was up all decked out in some red gown doing some odd jig. I'm sorry if that offended anyone, but it kind of weirded me out enough that I never forgot the scene and always watch for it when I'm in the area. Not mine, but my dad's story. He was hauling recycled steel in SC and stopped at a gas station to refuel and check the truck around 9 o'clock in the morning. He pulled up next to a light blue truck and saw a man who wasn't moving and was slumped down to get something. He didn't think anything of it, and he got his gas and left. The next day he was hauling again and went to the same gas station again around 9 o'clock. He saw an ambulance and a stretcher right next to the light blue truck. On the stretcher was the slumped down man. My dad thinks he died of a stroke or heart attack. At least he didn't die on the road. My grandparents were truck drivers, and I was with them for 6 weeks. We always stopped at rest stations to shower and sleep. One night we were at one and there was a man wandering around outside. He was there for a while. When we used the restroom, my grandma told me to stay away from him because there was a guy going around killing women at rest areas. He would go in and wait for them to come out and strangle them in the bathroom. I drive a truck for a Coca-Cola distributor in Illinois. I once had a very odd experience in a tiny farm town in the middle of nowhere. You would think a distributor truck would only stay in big towns where most grocery stores are, but every rink-dink gas station in every small town that sells Coke gets a delivery at least once a month. One morning I got my truck about 5 a.m. and my first stop was a fast stop in a town I had never heard of 45 minutes away. I put the address in Google Maps, and after doing pre-trip I was off. The roads that led to this town were narrow pothole-riddled roads with cornfields on either side the whole way with no route or anything leading to it, not very friendly to a semi or its load. I pull up and park in the large gravel lot adjacent to it, still pitch dark outside. I left the truck running and lights on as I usually do at quick stops. They only had about 10 cases, so I didn't have to pull the pallet up to the door, just loaded up my dolly and went inside. Very bizarre on the inside, mostly empty shelves, and old farm pictures. There was an old lady behind the counter and 4 incredibly old oddly dressed men sitting around a table drinking coffee, talking. I asked the lady where she wanted the load. No way I was stocking it for them, I wanted to get out of there. I'm usually not a skittish guy, but the vibes in there were just creepy. She pointed right behind the chair of a guy sitting at the table, so I wheeled it over. As I headed to the other side of the store, they all stopped talking and none of them looked at me. I dropped the stack and went back to the counter to get a check. As she was writing it, 2 of them men left and went outside. 5 minutes later I walked outside, and the truck door was open, and it was turned off. I ran over and no one was in sight. Everything was fine, it was just turned off. So, I load my dolly back up in the trailer and close it and head back to the truck. I go to turn it on, and the key isn't there. I turned on the interior light and an empty Mountain Dew can was on the floor, something I wouldn't have in there as the soda rivalry is insane, and that is a huge no for management. Even though it is one of my favorite sodas. I picked it up and I could hear the key jingling around in it. I dump it and a dipspit-covered key falls out. Disgusted, I wiped it off and continued to the rest of my route in more familiar territory. Not scary or anything, just an odd experience in the middle of BFE. Okay, you all not a trucker story, but still creepy as hell. We live in Detroit, Michigan. My aunt had a cleaning business and we would help out doing certain jobs. There was a house her church member wanted cleaned out so it could be rented. The home was her uncle's who had recently passed. Okay, so it's early fall, because I remember my cousin had to rake leaves, so the 3 of us there cleaning, throwing out boxes, etc. The lady said after we are done please leave on the porch light and upstairs so PPL wouldn't assume it's empty. So, we are done, locked doors etc. We get into my aunt's minivan. Pulling out of the driveway she's like we were supposed to leave a light on. She gets out to go to front door and I swear on my kids the porch lights came on. No, it wasn't a motion light. The home was older and outdated and this was around 01. My aunt looked, then got back in the car. No one really said anything, but as we were pulling out the upstairs light you can see came on through the window. We all just were like OMG. So, time went on and the church members had a tough time renting out the home. She says her daughter was staying there just to make it look occupied and she said the upstairs door kept slamming shut. Some neighbors claimed they seen a man going in and out of the garage, but when the police officers were called no one was there. It's 2020 and the house still stands. No one has moved in or bought it. My cousin had to make a long trip across the Midwest for work and being a woman, she felt like she needed to have some sort of protection, so she bought a handgun. As she was driving through the middle of nowhere in Kansas, no towns for miles and only saw other cars rarely. A truck passed her. Obviously, she thought nothing of it until 2 other trucks quickly came up from behind her, one driving in the lane next to her and the other following close behind as the truck in front started to slow down. And at this point she was getting overly concerned and pulled the gun out and set it on the dash. After noticing, the trucks moved away and let her pass. No idea what they were planning, but it could have been good. Obligatory not a truck driver, but I've done a lot of long-distance driving for assorted reasons. I've had a few creepy encounters, but there's one that I found funny that I just have to put out there. So, I was stationed in San Diego for a little over 5 years while in the Navy, living in the barracks, dry side, across the street from the ship base, wet side. I was dating a girl that lived in Coronado who still lived with her mom, no judgment there. Her mom usually was up and about the house all day, so she'd ask me to come over at night most of the time. So, this one night, I'm at the theater on Wet Side watching a movie 'cause it's free. I was a sailor and couldn't afford to do much else. when she texts me mid-movie and asks me to come over. Knowing what she had in mind, I quickly walked from the theater and over the bridge to Dryside to get to my car. Leaving base, the 15 freeway is an immediate right turn and then you take it to the Coronado Bridge to get to the island. At this point, it's around 23:30. As I'm going up the on-ramp, I can see clearly that a man was standing on the side of the on-ramp. I'd seen people walk there before even when the sun was up and never had I understood why, but whatever. I slow down in preparation that he might jump in front of me and sure enough, he walks out in front of me with his hands up. I tried to go around him, but he was shuffling sideways to stay in my way. I rolled down my window and shouted get out of my way, to which he responded with a banshee screech and starts running toward my car. Never had this happened, so I started laughing for some reason, maybe shock, and gunned it, passing him by inches while he smacked the back driver's side of my car. I got to my girlfriend's house a little shaky, so I smoke a cigarette while she goes to her backyard to smoke weed. I guess she was scared too. After a few hours at her place, she tells me I have to go cause her mom might not like me staying there. Afraid the weird man might still be there, I take an earlier exit and take Harbor Drive all the way back to try and go around him. As soon as I'm turning toward base and crossing the train tracks, he's back, this time with a friend. I had my window down and could hear him shout that man came back while he and his friend run toward my car. With more lanes, I was able to avoid them both and turn into the lanes that go onto the base. While I'm waiting to show my ID, I look back and they're both on the corner, watching my car but standing completely still. I guess they knew running at the gate guards wouldn't end well. Never saw them again for my remaining 2 years there, but looking back I just think it was funny for some reason. Not a truck driver, but I was around 18 or 19 years old, and I'd been out on the town with friends, and had bunked at one of their houses, but I had work, so I got up early, around 7 a.m., and was driving home. It was coming towards winter so was still dark out, just starting to get light. The trip was uneventful until I got to traffic lights at a crossroads. My light was red, so I slowed down to stop. As I rolled to a stop, a wild-looking bloke stepped out of the bushes at the side of the road and attempted to open my passenger side door to get in. Fortunately, my parents always taught me to lock all doors, except mine, when I'm driving alone, thanks to Mom and Dad. I freaked and floored the accelerator, running the red light. Fortunately, no other cars were around. When I got home we reported it to the police and the suggestion was that a patient at a head trauma/injury rehabilitation place near to the traffic lights had escaped or gone walkabout, as they weren't locked in or anything, and it's likely to be him, thinking I was slowing to give him a ride somewhere. Never heard anything further, although I know they did find the head trauma guy and return him to the rehab center. Scared of living though. Driving home from a casino late at night, she and the driver are in a lonesome stretch of road in late summer. The cornfields they were passing were full and tall by this point in the season. They made a slow curve and just as the headlights resettled on the straightaway, they again illuminated the other side of the road. This revealed the shape of a pale, lanky humanoid figure abruptly turning about face and immediately vanishing within the cornstalks. They both saw it, both freaked out, neither can describe it more than just saying it was virtually glowing due to how pale it was and that it had no discernible features they could make out that quickly aside from being upright on 2 legs. Now my story, still not a truck driver, we were headed home from Lake Tahoe after spending NYE up there with friends. We stayed late the following day and didn't end up leaving until it was dark out. Why? We were in college and apparently still stupid. The roads were clear, and weather was mild, but in Tahoe, the snow can pile on the side of the road nearly 8 to 10 feet tall in a good winter. We were making our way over the pass, which is pretty sparsely populated, for a couple of miles, and suddenly I saw a young guy in a flannel shirt and jeans just standing on the far side of the road staring at the 2-lane highway. I had enough time to spot him and watch him as we passed, but I didn't alert my boyfriend, assuming he obviously saw the very out-of-place guy standing on the side of the pass. As soon we were beyond him, I asked my BF if he saw the guy and WTF he thought he was doing out there. It wasn't surprising to me that my boyfriend was watching the dark slick road versus the tree line, but what was surprising is how sure he was that I didn't see anybody because there is no reason for a person to be in that particular spot. It wasn't a long enough sighting to feel menacing or any kind of way, but it was long enough to know for sure that I saw a man out there and long enough to know he couldn't comfortably be out there just chilling, watching the cars on the highway.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.